All right. I think that we looked at this right in the beginning of the semester. Does anybody remember this introductory lecture where we talked about the image of Akbar versus Aurangzeb? Yes, Huzaifa.
तो अकबर के बारे में ये मशहूर है कि अकबर काफ़ी लिबरल किस्म के थे और मतलब और मुख्तलिफ़ अदियान को जमा किया उन्होंने इस तरह नहीं था, मतलब सबको मजहबी आज़ादी दी गई, ठीक है। और औरंगज़ेब के बारे में ये मशहूर है कि उन्होंने इस आज़ादी को कम करने की कोशिश की और ये कि मुसलमानों की जो मुसलमानों को फ़ौक़ियत दी उन्होंने दूसरे मज़ाहिब पर, हिंदुओं पर और दूसरों पर। तो ये एक किस्म का एक कॉन्ट्रास्ट किया जाता है इन दोनों के दरमियान।
जबरदस्त। किसी को याद है कि ये कॉन्ट्रास्ट क्यों किया जाता है? सना।
Maybe miss because I don't really remember because I must have missed this class, but maybe because Akbar kept Hindus in his court and also abolished the jizya tax, whereas Aurangzeb brought back the jizya tax in his rule. Maybe.
Sure. This was very much in the beginning when we were talking about, popular perceptions. So, guys, by the way, tell me if you're seeing any blank spaces on the shared screen.
No.
No, good.
No,
Okay.
madam.
Okay. All right. So even the answers you guys are giving me are actually these answers. This is still more or less the kind of popular, but not too completely, like the Huffington Post, for instance. This is, I mean, it's arbitrary, but it's a respected publication. It's not a tabloid. They pride themselves in being intelligent. And so, in an article on Akbar, here's what we got. Ruler of most of South Asia, rejected bigotry. Akbar's actions are antithetical to current discrimination and violence against vulnerable religious communities. ये देख लें, ये बहुत ज़रूरी है, especially in Pakistan, because at that time, Pakistan, being an ideologically Islamic country, was much more under sort of liberal Western critique for treatment of its minorities. Now, of course, Hindutva, India has surpassed us and we're doing a little bit better. Anyway, so the point being that to remind you of the discussions we had in the beginning of term, that the politics of the present day are extremely important and pertinent to how we view history and the spin that we put on history. Now, here's the always direct contrast that you get. So Akbar had this pluralist vision. Pluralism का क्या मतलब है? कोई जल्दी से मुझे बता सकता है? What is pluralism? Pluralism, इसका क्या मतलब है? उमर.
Means accepting of different culture.
Oh, but I can't hear you. It's very garbled. Why don't you write it? Yes, plural is more than one. मगर अगर हम उसको एक sort of world view बना दें, pluralism और pluralist, तो उसका क्या मतलब होगा? Yes, encouraging or accepting of plural or multiple identities and truths and realities and cultures and religions, everything, right? So that's what pluralist means. So here we go. Akbar's pluralist vision for Mughal society was short-lived. His great-grandson Aurangzeb would end religious tolerance altogether. These are very sweeping statements. Please do note the language. And it is what you already think, because this is just an articulation of what we're all taught to think and the basic stuff that we read. So pay attention here. This is not true. And we will examine why. This is more of the same. You'll get the slide. Another, supposedly liberal neutral authority, which is not a politically compromised social media or tabloid entry. Same thing. Akbar's great because he won the loyalty of the non-Muslim populations of his realm, and he took an active interest in other religions. Aurangzeb is the last. His policies helped lead to dissolution and decline. Aurangzeb was a militant Orthodox Sunni Muslim. Hindus became subordinates, not colleagues. You see how the argument is framed? And it is a framing, right? Because you take a few things and you put them together and you create a picture. GNS.
Am I audible?
You are a little unclear.
I'll try to speak louder. Something interesting in the wording here, in the way that you mentioned it is framed, is, if I may link it to the reading, it's referring to how he was perhaps a good person and a bad person dichotomy, when we have bad person or tyrannical almost to Hindus, when Hindus themselves were not a self-identified category in and of itself until much later after Aurangzeb. And perhaps it were different Hindu communities, right? Like the Brahmins and the other ones that Aurangzeb interacted with. And I feel like he's been put into a lot of these modern sensibilities of like, like he treated these people this way, and he's like just. And I don't think we can think of him that way. I don't think that's fair to any historical subject.
Thank you, Anas and Josefa. That's absolutely right. These narratives assume that people thought in terms of the labels of public religious identity the same way we do today. They did not. Certainly not in big monolithic labels. There was no such thing as a sense of solidarity or a sense of having the same identity and background amongst Muslims of different classes who spoke different languages, and the same for very many different kinds of Hindus. Sarah, I vaguely remember something that Gibran said about Aurangzeb banning music, not for religious, but sentimental reasons. Yes, that's right. I had to choose between two of Audrey Trushk's articles on Aurangzeb since we covered the syllabus more slowly by virtue of being online. So anyway, she has a very nice paper. I'll give it to you for fun. You won't get examined on it, which actually tells that whole story. He banned the performance of certain types of recreational music in his personal palace environment, most likely because he associated it with the one great love of his life, who was a musician. Yes. So, again, to remind you, we get stuck in this, we think of the Mughals and it's Akbar and Aurangzeb, and everybody else in between is kind of interchangeable. And Akbar is the secular liberal Indian builder of the Mughal Empire. The Indians really took him to their heart. And Aurangzeb is the oppressive Muslim zealot, destroyer of the Mughal Empire. And please remind all of us, whoever can remember, that no, Aurangzeb did not fix the length of the beard. He did, however, amongst many, many other things, commission a comprehensive encyclopedia or dictionary of authoritative Hanafi fatwas of his age from various different scholars. And it's called the Fatwa Alamgiri, but they are not, and you know that Alamgir is Aurangzeb's title. They are not fatwas issued by Aurangzeb, but rather fatwas amongst Hanafi ulama that were compiled under his patronage. Right. The question I was going to ask was, when Aurangzeb in the historical narrative gets cast in this role, it's a role, right? And it's a familiar role of the model or stereotype of the oppressive Muslim uh, conqueror of non-Muslim India. So who else is in that category? Who else? Who are the other people who interchangeably fill this role in the historical narrative? Mahmud of Ghazna, that's right. Tipu Sultan, no, not quite. Tipu Sultan's very late in the day, and he basically fought against the British. Muhammad bin Qasim, thank you. Muhammad bin Qasim, Mahmud of Ghazna, Muhammad Ghori, to some extent, Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, all the big conquerors, right? Who were, as you now know, doing their own thing for their own complicated reasons, which were not this. Hence, you can assume now that Aurangzeb was also doing his own thing for his own complicated reasons. Okay, so what is interesting, and you guys are bringing up your school textbooks, is that the Western and secular Indian version of the story is this: Akbar the hero because he was secular and he was liberal, and he was the opposite of Aurangzeb. Now, what happens when you define one thing against another, right? When you define something by what it's not. And this is what is happening here, right? When you tell the whole story of the Mughal presence and even the Muslim presence in India through this paradigm, then you get this mutual exclusivity, that Akbar is Akbar because he's not Aurangzeb, and Aurangzeb is Aurangzeb because he's not Akbar. And so the room for commonalities and gray areas is kind of lost. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we never questioned this paradigm, which is older. It's from British colonial times. We just flipped it. Aurangzeb is the absolute opposite of Akbar, and Akbar is the absolute opposite of Aurangzeb, which means Aurangzeb was actually an amazing Muslim who was the champion of the Muslim nation in India. He did not let Islam get adulterated and Muslim power, wiped out in India. So we owe him a lot. And because Akbar is the opposite of Aurangzeb, therefore, Akbar is non-Muslim and the enemy of the cause of Islam in India. Now that's a very long way to come from what Akbar might actually have been up to and what he believed. He was many things and he was unusual, but he was not non-Muslim and he was not in any way an enemy of Islam or Muslim ascendancy in the subcontinent. One of the reasons being that it wouldn't even occur to him. ये भी जो कहानी है ना कि औरंगज़ेब ने चैम्पियन किया इस्लाम को और अकबर ने जो है अपनी पीठ मोड़ ली इस्लाम पर, ये भी एक बहुत कंटेम्प्रेरी सिचुएशन से निकली हुई कहानी है, where Muslims in the subcontinent became the underdog, and generally in the world, right, became the underdog, and had to think in terms of protection and defense and so on. But in Akbar's time, he did not have to think that way. Being a Muslim, he belonged to the dominant civilization of the known world. He had zero doubts in his mind, and he wouldn't have had any doubts in his mind that he belonged to the most superior civilization of his world. And there would be no reason for him to reject it or turn his back on it. What he did do was take on the, I won't even say orthodox, but to take on the ulama establishment of his time, mainly because he felt that having enjoyed political power for so long, being ministers under, for generations under Delhi sultans, and then his father and his grandfather and him, that particular class of politically powerful and rich ulama had become very corrupt. They were very much like um, the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. And he really cleaned house. And when he cleaned house and went after the corrupt ulama, they obviously were not going to take it lying down, and pointed fingers at him for being not properly Islamic and not properly deferential to the cause of Islam in India. But it really came down to a question of personalities clashing. Okay, so because Akbar is not Aurangzeb, Akbar becomes secular and Akbar becomes non-Muslim, because to be secular means to be not religious. This too is an oxymoron, right? How can Akbar be secular? Because secularism wasn't a thing. It's not even a concept in his world, because there's no compartmentalization of life, and certainly no compartmentalization of God and spirituality. God is present everywhere. This is very much, Akbar lives very much in a God-centric universe. So to trace where the story begins of Akbar being molded into this now popular image, we need to go back to the time when the British first discovered him. In the 1760s, when the East India Company quite accidentally becomes the ruler of Bengal, that's Robert Clive, dude in the wig and the red jacket, and that is the current Mughal emperor in the 1760s, Shah Alam II. Shah Alam II is officially in a proper Mughal court ritual awarding the sanad for the Diwani of Bengal onto the East India Company, represented here by Robert Clive. Having got the Diwani of Bengal, and this is a really, really important point, which is why that date is on your timeline. And the important point is that when the British took over direct administration of the Mughal province of Bengal, they did not seek to establish independent, sovereign control over Bengal. They were only interested in the money. right, in the land and the tax collection rights. And it never even occurred to them that they could rule in their own name. They did what everybody in India at the time was doing. They ruled in the name of the Mughal emperor with a proper legal sanad from the Mughal emperor. Everybody ruled that way. The Nawab of Hyderabad, the Nawab of Awadh, you name it, Raja Ranjit Singh, they all ruled in the name of the Mughal emperor with a legal document saying that they did so. Why is that important? It's important because sovereignty, which means the source of legitimacy and authority, remained with the Mughal emperor. He was the only possible sovereign recognized across the subcontinent. खैर, अब दीवानी मिल गई, क्या करें? Suddenly they're responsible for administering a place that is bigger in terms of land and population than all of Great Britain. It's also a place with its own old and sophisticated culture. And they need to figure out, the British need to figure out how to conduct themselves in Bengal, how to understand this place, how to control it effectively. And their first thought is that we have to behave in an Indian fashion. So they get a Diwani from the Mughal emperor. They establish a very Mughal Persian system. They just continue with the old Mughal system of bureaucratic management. It is Mughal tax collectors who are still out there in the field doing their work. It's just that now they're reporting to the EIC instead of the Nawab of Bengal. Similarly, they felt it was important to truly learn the culture of Mughal India to be successful there. And that is why this period is often called the period of the White Mughals. What is a White Mughal? A White Mughal is a British officer connected to or serving the East India Company who immerses himself in Indian culture and civilization and becomes part of the late Mughal noble class. So they learn Farsi, they learn Urdu, they indulge in sher shairi, they go to mushairas, they go to kotas, they marry Indian wives, often Muslim wives, by the way, from good families, or they keep, courtesan, tawaif mistresses. They wear kurta pajamas and they eat pan. And they have a healthy respect for this rich and highly civilized place that they have landed up in. The first Governor General of the East India Company, who was directly responsible for Bengal, was a guy called Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings needed to actually set up a system of government in Bengal under the British. And he is the one who primarily articulated this British perception in Bengal that we gotta behave the way the Mughals behave because there's an established system. It works. These guys are richer than us. They know what they're doing. We have to learn what they're doing. And one of the many things that he does is he orders certain important books to be translated from Farsi into English. And one of the first books that he has translated is the Akbar Nama, and the third volume of the Akbar Nama is the Aine Akbari. The Akbar Nama and the Aine Akbari are the major sources for Akbar's reign and Akbar's style of administration. So this is what Warren Hastings writes in the preface to the English translation of the Ain Akbari, which, by the way, is the first complete Persian text from India to be translated into English. He says, though every branch of Indian literature will prove a valuable acquisition to the stock of European knowledge, this work will be found peculiarly valuable as it comprehends, yani ke encompasses, the original constitution of the Mughal Empire, described under the inspection of its founder, right? To them, Akbar's the founder. And it will serve to assist the judgment of the Court of Directors of the EIC on many points of importance. It will show where the measures of Mughal administration approach to the first principles. Does anybody remember looking at Lord Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education? What did he say about Indian literature? जी हुज़ैफा।
उसने कहा था कि एक बुक शेल्फ के बराबर भी नहीं है अगर यूरोपियन किताबों को रखा जाए, और अगर तमाम संस्कृति और अरबी और मतलब इन तमाम जितनी भी उलूम फ़नून हैं उन ज़बानों में, तो वो एक अच्छी यूरोपियन लाइब्रेरी के एक शेल्फ के बराबर भी नहीं होगा, मतलब जो भी उन्होंने लिखा।
थैंक यू। ये बिल्कुल पोलर ऑपोजिट वर्ल्ड व्यू है। हाँ, yes, Shahan, they were not merely inspired by the Mughal way of administration, they considered it superior. They understood that they needed to learn it. Now, the guy who actually did the translating was a fellow called Francis Gladwin. Here we want just for a minute to think about what is happening in Europe in the mid 18th century, right? In the 1700s. ये लोग आए कहाँ से हैं? इनकी क्या socialization थी? ये सोचते कैसे थे? So this is, as many of you have brought it up often, this is the age of enlightenment in Europe. Now, the age of enlightenment had several, values and hallmarks. One was that they believed in a kind of rational pragmatism, that everything happens for a practical reason and there's like some rationality behind it. They believed in something called deism, which, yes, Shahan, has to do with not the fall of church rule, but a further distancing of the political and intellectual elite from the church. Deism, what is a deity? A deity means any divine being who's worshipped. Deism is this very generic idea that there is some divine origin to the universe, but it is not the way that it is explained in institutionalized religion, right? So they are believers in the existence of God, but they reject strict church doctrine. And then they also, because of being rational pragmatists, there is another philosophy that is fashionable at the time, which is enlightened absolutism. The idea of the best possible rule being the rule of an enlightened philosopher king. Yes, Josefa, they reject organized religion but are not atheist. That's part of the European Enlightenment intellectually. So, Francis Gladwin, being a rational pragmatist, a deist, and a believer in enlightened absolutism. Yes, exactly similar to Plato's idea and coming very much from Plato's Republic, because the rediscovery of the Greek classics, as you know, had a lot to do with the European Renaissance and the European Enlightenment. So he says of Akbar, Akbar was a universally great and good ruler. He was very successful, having made several conquests. Nor should it be considered as a weak part of his character, listen to this, that he wished to be regarded as one who was under the influence of divine inspiration, since it is not unreasonable to suppose that his motives for doing so were purely political. Can someone explain to me what Francis Gladwin is saying about Akbar here? First of all, what about Akbar has impressed Gladwin? Yeah, conquests, right? The power, very successful, several conquests, reduced to obedience, all Hindustan. ठीक है ना, तो वो सलूट कर रहे हैं अकबर को for his worldly success. Then he's kind of apologetic about Akbar. What is it that he feels needs to be explained away about Akbar, and how does he explain it away? He's saying that Akbar used religion for political reasons, meaning Ramin, the obedience line, yeah, does make one think that they intended to do this themselves, but at the time they didn't. तो वहमो गुमान में भी नहीं था. Why does he want to say that Akbar Hiba, basically saying that he followed religion which was compulsory for him and is regarded as a weakness? He didn't just follow religion. What do you think? Look what he's saying. He
वो
wished.
खुद
जी बोलो.
वो खुद उस तरह की मतलब इंस्पिरेशन मतलब करने लग गया था दीन इलाही की उस सारे चक्कर के अंदर, तो वो उसकी मतलब वजह पेश कर रहा है कि उसको हम इस तरह न देखें कि मतलब वो कुछ मतलब वाकई में इस तरह की कुछ उसके दिमाग में कुछ चीज़ें थी, बल्कि ये कि ये बिल्कुल इसका पॉलिटिकल एक्शन था, इसको हम इस तरह देखना चाहिए.
Thank you, Josefa. Right? That he wished to be regarded as somebody who was under the influence of divine inspiration. Now, this is kind of embarrassing to Francis Gladwin, who's already made him into this Enlightenment era hero who's very rational and pragmatic and successful. And so, if he's so rational and pragmatic and successful, then he can't kind of be serious about the hocus pocus that he seems to have been doing in his performance of spirituality. So Gladwin explains it away by saying that he probably did it to, placate the masses. ये लफ्ज आप लोग भी बहुत इस्तेमाल करते हैं ना, हम करते हैं और आपको करना नहीं चाहिए. मैसेज, ये आया कहाँ से है? ये जो नोशन है मैसेज का, दिस इज अ वेरी ब्रिटिश colonial notion also, that there is an elite who knows better, and it is their job to look after the stupid, illiterate, ignorant, innocent masses. And that's kind of what Gladwin is saying here, that Akbar had to do this in order to, probably felt he had to do this in order to impress the masses. Sorry, Sarin, that's the second time I think you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just asking that this his opinion is because of the recent enlightenment. Otherwise, he might have regarded this as a very spiritual. If he had made these comments during before the Protestant before the Renaissance, this would not have been considered a weakness. This would have considered a divine rule from God, just like monarchy. So
Absolutely.
I was just confirming that.
Yeah. It's very much who he was and where he was coming from. The way we think is shaped by our historical context. So Warren Hastings and Francis Gladwin are living in, they are products of 18th century Europe, which is dominated by Enlightenment era thinking, and they are operating in the context of late Mughal India, which is still very Mughal and still considered by them very rich, powerful, and sophisticated. Ramin, is he saying that Akbar wanted his reputation to be of some? Yeah, he's saying that Akbar was pretending. Oh, I'm not going to get into this, but basically, lots and lots of things happened in the 1780s very, very quickly, not the least of which was the British loss of the American colonies, right? In 1776, America threw out the British and established an independent country. So, what's happening in the world is always very important. Um, Here, the British are doing their thing, the EIC is doing its thing in India, but the EIC is connected to Britain, and Britain is connected to European politics and world politics. So, just as the discovery of the Americas, if you remember Gibran's lecture, in the 16th century, the discovery of the Americas actually made possible the suddenly increased high level of trade between Europe and India, because the Europeans suddenly had access to loads of actual gold and silver, because there were gold and silver mines, especially in South America. And they mined the hell out of them and brought all that gold and silver to Europe. With that, it's literally like free cash. It had nothing to do with their economy. They built their economy out of that accidental stumbling onto free cash. So, having mined coins, minted coins out of all the gold and silver bullion that they had found in the Americas, they brought it to Asia, to India and China, to buy up all the luxury goods that Europe, जिनकी बहुत demand थी Europe में, and then they would go back and sell them for a profit there. Similarly, the loss of America as a colony in 1776 had a profound effect on the thinking of the British vis-a-vis their emerging colony in India. So, in London in 1784, you actually get the British Parliament passing a piece of legislation called the India Act. And then, based on that, Warren Hastings is thrown out. Warren Hastings is actually disgraced and thrown out. He's replaced by a guy called Lord Cornwallis, who then establishes something called the Bengal Act in 1793, which becomes the blueprint of British rule in Bengal and later India. Now, Warren Hastings was discredited for a bunch of complex reasons, but what happened साथ is that because he was impeached and discredited, everything he stood for was also discredited, right? So Warren Hastings this is a cartoon in a newspaper from the time. If Warren Hastings is discredited, then everything he said, like this, also becomes discredited. So we've come now, it's a very short period from the 1760s to the 1790s. 1790s to 1800, things change rapidly in the British mindset about how to deal with their newly acquired colonies in India. First of all, till they lost America, they didn't even think of Bengal as a colony. Having lost America, Bengal suddenly became more economically important as a British holding. And so they then started to consciously think about India and Indian territories as important colonies to focus on. More and more British people started to come and live and work in British administered Bengal. And some of them were scholar bureaucrats. They came as administrative officers of the EIC, but they also had scholarly interests. And the most important of these scholar bureaucrats was a guy called William Jones. William Jones was primarily a linguist. He learned Arabic, he learned Persian, and eventually he learned Sanskrit. Having learned Sanskrit, he came up with this very interesting linguistically based argument, because ancient Sanskrit has a lot in common with ancient Greek, because they are both Indo-European. They both belong to something called the Indo-European language family. And so, based on that little linguistic discovery, William Jones develops an entire historical narrative about India. First, he identifies that the followers of Sanskrit scriptures in India are different from Muslims. The British hadn't realized this yet, quite realized this, okay? Everybody was just kind of a Mughal to them. And so you get the first narrative of, aha, our Indian subjects are actually of two varieties. Just like there are two varieties of Europeans, Protestant and Catholic, there are two varieties of Indians, Hindu and Muslim. They're the first ones to use this word, Hindu, at this time. Then, because the Sanskrit literatures of India are older than the Persian literatures of India, William Jones establishes a story of precedence. कि वो पहले आए थे तो असली इंडियन वो हैं. अब अगर असली इंडियंस जो हैं वो सांस्कृतिक सिविलाइजेशन के फॉलोअर्स हैं और मुसलमान बाद में बाहर से आए थे, तो narrative, can you see it developing? This is a really important part of the development of the narrative. The important part of the development of the narrative being that the original inhabitants, that somehow being the original or older inhabitants of India made the Hindus the legitimate Indians. And suddenly, after like 1,000 years of being here, all Indian Muslims are labeled foreign after 1,000 years. So yes, but much of it is about delegitimizing Mughal rule and Muslim rule, absolutely. Thank you, Zubair and Sarin. It is also, interestingly, has to do with an older European perception of Islamic empire that people like William Jones would have brought with them. So, as you should know, the final destruction and end of the Roman Empire occurred when the Ottomans, or Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, finally conquered the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and thank you, Zephyr, and sent the last Roman Empire emperor scurrying into exile. That was the end of the Roman Empire. I mean, there are many arguments to be made. In Europe itself, the Western Roman Empire had ended ages ago because of the Germanic tribes that came down from the mountains and got rid of them. But no, the prominent narrative in the 19th century became this clash of civilizations narrative, that ancient European civilization received its death blows from the sword of Islam. That is where the sword of Islam narrative goes back to. It actually goes all the way back to the Crusades, which is 10th, 11th, 12th century. So this popular narrative in Europe of the sword of Islam is now brought to Mughal India. Then हाँ बिल्कुल जैसे इन्होंने रोमन एम्पायर और यूरोप को बुली किया था, उसी तरह से इन्होंने हिंदुओं को आके कॉन्कर किया और बुली किया. तो ये वही वाले मुसलमान हैं, right? It's creating more of this global monolithic category of all Muslims being bloodthirsty conquerors. The stereotype. Now, what happens to Akbar as this anti-Islamic narrative is developing even in India? Akbar somehow survives it. He remains somebody that British historians and British administrators admire. But in order to keep admiring him and to keep him as a model historical figure in Indian history, they have to further de-Islamicize him. And they do that by coming up with this narrative, which is now, Akbar is just stuck with it, that he was an enlightened, good, successful ruler because he had a religious policy that accepted the natives of India. Now, this is a far cry from this. Francis Gladwin in the 70s is not in the least bit interested in Akbar's treatment of the Hindus. But by 1800, Akbar's image has now become this. The idea that the British should rule India as Indian rulers no longer directs knowledge production about India. So what are the British now interested in? They're interested in learning about the more recent histories of India or the more recent events in India that actually bother them at that time. Now, around 1800, the main threat that the British are dealing with, their main rivals in the expansion over the Indian economy, are the Marathas. And that is all happening in the Deccan. So they start to focus on the recent history of the Deccan more as a military intelligence report कि यहाँ हुआ क्या और ये मराठे आए कहाँ से हैं और अब हम इनका करें क्या. And the story that they come up with is that Aurangzeb, with his final crazy Islamic conquest jihad wars in the Deccan, produced the hostile Marathas. He angered them, he needled them, and he made them into the belligerent local power that the British had to deal with. And why did the Marathas become this powerful, belligerent military kingdom? Because Aurangzeb didn't understand that he needed to pacify the Hindus in the way that Akbar had done. He screwed it all up because he was always being too much of a bigoted Muslim and pissing off the Hindus. As a result, you have the Marathas loose in the Deccan, and the British have to fight with them. So Aurangzeb then starts to get cast into this role of villain. But if the British were not fighting wars against the Marathas in the Deccan at this time, they may never have started to study Aurangzeb, and they may never have actually come up with that narrative. Okay, do we remember James Mill and his periodization? ये periodization आई कहाँ से है? जी अली. Oh, I can't hear you, beta.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So this was the periodization of Indian history as by British K. It sort of categorized them into three parts. The history of India. Basically, it sort of labeled the first one as the Hindu golden age. ठीक है, जिसमें इंडिया के अंदर बहुत ज़्यादा बड़े glorious temples बने थे, royal temples, and then it
Classical का मतलब ही यही है ना. In English that it has a very positive connotation. ठीक है, carry on.
जी. And then उसके बाद एक मुस्लिम एज आती है जिसमें मुस्लिम इन्वेडर्स आते हैं, मुस्लिम इन्वेजन्स आती हैं, they plunder those sort of temples and raid India, and then उसके ऊपर इंडिया के ऊपर अपनी एक वो काबिज इंडिया के ऊपर काबिज हो जाते हैं. ठीक है, तो उसके अंदर इंडिया का डिक्लाइन आता है और इंडिया का डार्क एज आती है, sort of medieval एज आती है. ठीक है, and then the British come and the British sort of rescue India from that dark ages and push it into a modern age.
Thank you.
एक तो ये just one thing more, आपने हमें ये शुरू में इस तरह का ये समझाया था ये नैरेटिव, बट मैं एज इफ जिस तरह हमने साउथ एशियन हिस्ट्री पढ़ना शुरू की है, आई sort of felt कि like हम खुद इस तरह पढ़ रहे हैं इसको, हिस्ट्री को. हमने शुरू में हिंदू ट्रेडिशंस को पढ़ा था, एंड देन हम एहसान और तसव्वुफ को पढ़ना शुरू किया और मुगलों को. अब इसके बाद पता नहीं किधर डायरेक्शन जाती है, बट मैं खुद इसको फाइंड कर रहा हूँ कि हम इस तरह पढ़ रहे हैं.
You're not wrong. And so chronology is one thing. We've been following more or less a chronological, organization of what we're looking at. But placing value judgments on the chronology is a different thing. So ये जो नाम दिए गए हैं ना, Indian classical age, Indian medieval age, and then modern age, these are very loaded labels which are placing value judgments on chronological periods. And yes, you're absolutely right, in that the pre-Islamic Indian past is by no means the Hindu period. In fact, much of India for a very, very long time, especially before the first arrival of Muslims, was probably under different forms of Buddhist rule, as well as there were flourishing pockets of Buddhist culture all over, at least North India. So it's what I would like you to do is to think in terms of let's go to the timeline. Okay, there is a pre-Aryan Indian past, of which we really only know from the few excavations of what we call the Indus Valley civilization. It's the oldest thing we know. Then there's the arrival of Sanskrit-speaking peoples from somewhere, probably Iran and Central Asia. We call them the Aryans, but Sanskrit is really more of a marker than any kind of ethnicity. So the Sanskrit-speaking peoples arrive, and they bring with them a Sanskrit literature, which they further develop as they start to settle in India and start to take ownership of India as a homeland. So maybe the better thing is to really call it, as Eaton does, right? The period of Sanskritic civilizations, the period of the diffusion of Sanskritic civilizations in India. And then you have the period of the diffusion and ascendancy of Islamo-Persian or Perso-Islamic civilizations and cultures in India. So literature and language can be used as a marker as much as religion, but in fact, actually they go together, right? So when we talk about Sanskritic texts and cultures, we are talking about the core corpus of Sanskrit texts, जिसमें religious texts भी हैं और किस्म की texts भी हैं. And the same is true for the Perso-Islamic period. But when we call these periods classical, medieval, and modern, what is the value judgment that we're putting on them? Yeah, Sarah, can you say more? You're on it. Okay, Sarin.
Yeah, so basically what's by classical, they are in a way referring to that's proper, that's what's supposed to be, that's historic. But basically, they have precedence. They by classical, I think that's what they're trying to say. Also, using the term medieval is to show that in the European times, medieval age was when Western Rome fell, and it was the dark ages of Europe. So they are in a way showing that the Muslims are coming in, destroying all the culture, because that's what happened in the dark ages. In a way, they are portraying them as someone who's destroying society, and of course, they are referring to themselves as modern. So it's to refer to in a way that they are better, or they are the updated versions to help rule the empire. I think that's what this is.
Thank you, Sarim, and Shahan and Sarah. So basically, sorry, this is actually a mapping of European history and historical narratives and periodizations onto India. The Europeans thought of themselves as having a classical era of history, which was the Greek and then the Roman civilizations, which, the Greeks were for the Europeans, were the fathers of rational philosophy and science and art and literature, that civilization for them was defined by the Greek Golden Age. And then the Romans continued, they totally based their culture on the Greek heritage. And at the same time, the Romans also established a very large empire over all of Europe and parts of Western Asia and North Africa. It was a very big empire. And modern British people, right now, the 19th century British people really looked up to the Roman Empire. They glorified it because they thought of it as that the Roman Empire was the way that all of Europe became civilized. Because before the Romans conquered France and Germany and Britain, the local natives in these places were barbarians, and they were taught to be civilized by the Romans, who brought law and technology and language and literature and philosophy and mathematics and science to these places because they were intellectually superior. But the main thing they were very good at, they were very, very good at administration. The Roman Empire was very smart at administration. So the classical era in Europe covers everything from the ancient Greeks to the Romans. And then, of course, this classical civilized golden age of Europe dies a violent death because of the Germanic tribes and, of course, the sword of Islam. And Europe descends into its medieval period, which, as all of you pointed out, is the Dark Ages, right? So in Europe, it is remembered as the Dark Ages. Why? Because a certain type of very Dakhyanusi Catholic Christianity comes to dominate Europe, and that conservative Catholic Christianity rejects the Greek and Roman heritage, rejects Greek science and philosophy as being ungodly, and actively suppresses that stuff. So the entire classical heritage is actually lost in Europe during the long dark ages because all the books have been burnt. You know, right, that they came back to Europe through the Arabic translations of the Greeks that had been done in the Islamic empires. Anyway, so the Europeans had this own vision of their middle centuries as being the Dark Ages that were heavily, defined by a medieval Catholic Church, by the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, so on and so forth. And then the modern era in Europe is again defined religiously. It is defined as people coming out from under the yoke of the medieval Catholic Church, right? Of discovering themselves intellectually by reconnecting to their classical era heritage, by reading Socrates and Plato and Aristotle again because they had found them again. And on those, they had based a modern civilization with modern political philosophy and, most importantly, modern science and technology. So if that is what these labels mean in the European mind, now you can properly understand what they mean when they are applied to Indian history. Yes, Shahan, their narrative became that we have come to India because it is obviously our predestined divine mission, by the way. They were not secular to that extent yet, to bring modern civilization to the rest of the world. India was just one part of it. So in order to further not just justify but glorify British rule in India, the immediately preceding period, which happened to be the very long Perso-Islamic period, was systematically in the 19th century, was systematically portrayed as being terrible, right? So here we are, we have come to save original India from these barbarians who have been oppressing it for 1,000 years. I'm going to let you go in 5 minutes, okay? So we can quickly look at what happens to Aurangzeb. Now, we've seen the journey of Akbar and how he emerges as more and more secular and de-Islamicized. Now, साथ Aurangzeb के साथ क्या होता है? Now we're going back in time again. The first people to write about Aurangzeb were non-British Europeans who had met him, who were his contemporaries, who had come to his court. One of the famous ones is a Frenchman called Francois Bernier, who was a big admirer of Aurangzeb's, and said that, this prince is endowed with a versatile and rare genius. He is a consummate statesman and a great king. In the era of the White Mughals, another bureaucrat scholar like Francis Gladwin was a guy called Alexander Dow. He writes about Aurangzeb very much the way Gladwin had written about Akbar. Aurangzeb held the cloak of religion between his actions and the vulgar being the masses, and thanked the divinity for his success which he owed to his wickedness. So what is he saying? He's saying that actually Aurangzeb was a very practical, Machiavellian, successful ruler who did do wicked things, but he was still successful. And in order to cover up the wicked things he did to be successful, like killing his brothers, although they all killed their brothers, that's how wars of succession happened. Dow says that Aurangzeb pretended that it was Islam that was causing him to behave in this manner. Again, he is attributing Aurangzeb's relationship with religion to purely practical political motivations, just like Gladwin did with Akbar. Why did he call the masses vulgar? Vulgar at that time simply meant uneducated. It meant somebody unrefined, not what it means for us today. Then in the Victorian age, it started to mean obscene. Here it doesn't. Here it means unrefined. Now we come to 1790s and 1800 when the British are dealing with the Marathas in the Deccan. And here's what they conclude. There are no states or powers on the continent of India with whom our nation, the British, has a connection or concern, who do not owe their present condition to the reign of Aurangzeb or its influence on the reigns of his successors. This is it's a throwaway line, but it's very significant because everybody continued to treat the later Mughals, the ones who came after Aurangzeb, as being completely unimportant and without agency because Aurangzeb had just set something in motion that nobody could do anything about. And that the crazy state of India in the late 18th, early 19th century had all been created by Aurangzeb, and the British had to come and clean up this mess. Little bit later, here's the growing narrative. But although Aurangzeb could conquer enervated, that means de-energized kings, he could not subdue the minds of their uncorrupted subjects. Who are the uncorrupted subjects? The Hindu natives. Aurangzeb's zeal for the Mohammedan religion led him to deprive the Hindu princes of those indulgences which his less bigoted ancestors, aka Akbar, had allowed. He destroyed their temples and disgraced them with the jizya, capitation tax as jizya. This tyranny weakened the affections of the ancient vassals of the house of Timur and raised such a spirit of resistance in the hardy natives of the Deccan. The hardy natives of the Deccan who are resisting, everybody are the Marathas. Did Aurangzeb destroy temples? One. Shah Jahan actually destroyed a lot more temples than him. Why did they destroy temples? Usually because there was some illegality to where they were built, not because they were Hindu. (1829), right? This is very close to 1835, where John Macaulay makes his famous minute speech on education. The rapid success of Akbar in subjugating the greater portion of India by a policy, ab yahan dekho, from Gladwin to here. Why was Akbar successful? Not because he was a smart general, but because he elevated the Hindus. And the rapid downfall of the government of Aurangzeb is because he oppressed the Hindu population. Aurangzeb briefly reinstated the jizya because he needed to quickly raise funds for a new military campaign. And that was one of the few taxes that was sort of left that could be levied. So his reasons were rather practical. All right, I think we will stop there today. And we will come to the origin of the myth of Deen-e-Ilahi on Tuesday. Ali, did you have a question?
No, ma'am. It was just a comment. I think we can leave that for right now. अभी
All
class
right.
खत्म.
Okay, guys. Take care.